It's March 21st, and like many of you, I'm here at home. So if you're following along with our chronological Through the Bible reading plan at Asbury Community Church, we actually find ourselves in Deuteronomy chapters 30 and 31 today. Moses has just finished reading the law to all of Israel, to the generation of Israelites who are actually going into the Promised Land after their 40-year wandering. All this as a result of the previous generation not believing in God's promise, thinking that he wasn't strong enough to overcome the people there, and that their wives and children would be taken as slaves. And so God was like, fine, your children get the land, you don't. And so that 40 years is finally over, and he's just told the people about all the blessings of obeying God and all of the curses, negative consequences of disobedience. And we pick up in chapter 30, verse 1. It says, "And when all these things had come upon you, the blessings and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call to mind among the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, with all your heart and with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. If you're outcast in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you." You see, God knew his people would disobey him in the future, and he let them know. Even when you fail, even when you disobey and follow false gods, if you turn back to me, then all the promises I gave you in the past will be yours. He knew they would disobey, and we'll read all of that in the book of Judges, starting on March 30th. But his promise and his forgiveness and his blessings would always stand. As long as they turned back to him, he would fulfill his promises. He goes on to tell them in verse 5, "And the Lord your God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that you may possess it, and he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. For the Lord will again take delight in prospering you as he took delight in your fathers, when you obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes that are written in this book of the law, when you turn to the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul." You see, God doesn't force us to follow him. He always gives us a choice. He tells us what life is going to be like if we obey, the blessings. He tells us what life will be like if we disobey. Those were the curses. And he says, you choose. And none of his people could say, I didn't know what to do, because he gave them his law in that book, and he wrote it down, gave it to the priests, and the priests would teach it to them regularly. And even today, we have his word that is the most translated book and most distributed book in all of human history. So it's not far from any of us. Going on in verse 11, "For this commandment that I command to you today is not hard for you either, neither is it far off." And we're skipping on to verse 14, "But the word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can do it." Again, it's always our choice, as he says in verse 15. "I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away, you will not hear, but you are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over into the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land of the Lord, that swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them." So now we find ourselves in chapter 31, and we read about how the leadership is going to transfer from Moses to Joshua. Chapter 31, verse 1. "So Moses continued to speak these words to all of Israel, and he said to them, I am 120 years old today. I am no longer able to go out and come in. And the Lord has said to me, you shall not go over to the promised land and over the Jordan." So why wasn't Moses going? He led them for 40 years. Now granted, 120 years old, and he's not able to go out and come in. he's kind of, getting to the end of his life. But this goes all the way back to when Moses and Aaron disobeyed God, all the way back in Numbers chapter 20. And God was telling Moses to provide water for the people. They were complaining again. And he said, you're going to pull water out of this rock. But he gave them a different way of doing this, because this is the second time that water would come out of the rock, or a rock, to give the Israelites water to drink. The first time, all the way back in Exodus 17, God tells Moses to take his staff and strike the rock, and then water would come out. But this time God has a little different instruction for Moses. He says, speak to the rock and the water will come out. Now Moses and Aaron, they go in front of the people, and here's their mistake. They do it the way they had always done it before. And Moses and Aaron actually try and claim credit for what was about to happen. He says, shall we, not God, shall we bring water out of this rock for you? And he strikes the rock. So the Bible says twice. Now, my take on it is that Moses probably struck the rock and nothing happened. And I'm thinking God was giving him a little chance to, okay, back up. What did I say? Speak to it. Do that now. He doesn't do that. He strikes it a second time, and God provides for his people. Water comes out of the rock. But he pulls Moses and Aaron aside later and says, you did bad. You didn't trust me as holy in front of the people. You trusted in the stick. You trusted in the method. You're not going into the promised land as a result. That's a big deal, worthy of the punishment that God was giving Moses of not being able to go into the promised land. However, God did graciously show Moses the promised land before he died. And he took him up to the top of Mount Nebo, and through a vision, he showed him all the land of Israel to let Moses know, hey, don't worry. You were leading them to a good place. You were leading them to a good land. You did a great thing, and they'll remember you for this. Don't worry about it. And then, of course, Moses doesn't go into the promised land, but he ends up going to heaven instead. Bummer. I don't think he was complaining. But later on, even in the Gospels, Moses does come back with Elijah on the top of the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to the top, and he shows his glory. Moses and Elijah show up and talk with him. And so Moses actually, after the fact, got to be in the promised land. And if you believe in the book of Revelation, that Moses is that second witness that comes back with Elijah in the end times, declaring the gospel, gets killed, is dead 4 days in the street, God raises him back to life. There'll be 2 times he actually got to come back. But again, he had to leave heaven both of those times. So again, I don't think he was complaining he didn't get to go there. God still got to let him see it. So God is a very gracious and merciful and forgiving God. One more thing as we wrap this up. Moses is transferring leadership to Joshua. Actually, it's God transferring the leadership from Moses to Joshua for the people. And 3 times in this passage, 4 times in Joshua chapter 1, Joshua is told by God, by Moses, and once by the people, be strong and courageous. Great leaders are replaced with new leaders, and we're not sure that they're going to be as good as they were before. Some of you actually might be called to replace a great leader, and you might be thinking, how in the world can I live up to what this person has done? Now, whether you take the place of a leader or you're following a new leader, be assured it is God who places leaders in places of authority. And whether you're leading or following, we are to be strong and courageous. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 tells us not once but twice that God establishes the authorities. Now, repeating is the way that the Bible says, hey, this is important. So we actually really need to remember God places our leaders in place for his purposes. And it allows, no one goes into a place of leadership without God's allowing. So the people we follow, they may not lead as the same as the person before. They may not lead the way that we think they should. And you might be that new leader, actually, that is being criticized for not being the same as the person before, or even accused of, you don't know what you're doing. In either case, leader or follower, be strong and courageous. If you're leading, prayerfully lead as you sense God directing you, knowing that he called you, he established you in that place of leadership. And if you're following a leader, remember that it is God who appointed them to that place. And unless they instruct us to do something that is against God's law, we are to follow them. It's part of our Christian witness. This truth is so important especially as we walk through this global pandemic right now. Remember, God is still in control, and we can trust His decisions to carry us through this and any crisis. Hopefully you guys will tune in tomorrow to hispericommunitychurch.org at 9:30, see our Sunday morning worship service, and we'll continue to do some of these video devotions going forward.